It was a dark and stormy night, and John was driving home from a long day at work. He had taken a shortcut through the forest to save some time, but as he drove down the narrow, winding road, he realized he was lost. The rain was pouring down in sheets, making it difficult to see more than a few feet in front of him. The only light came from his headlights, which seemed to be swallowed up by the darkness. As he drove on, he suddenly saw a pair of glowing eyes in the distance. At first, he thought it was a pair of headlights from another car, but as he got closer, he realized it was a deer standing in the middle of the road. John slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car skidded on the wet pavement, and he hit the deer with a sickening thud. He got out of the car to check on the deer, but it was nowhere to be found. He searched the area with his flashlight, but the animals seemed to have vanished into thin air. Shaken and confused, John got back into his car and continued driving. As he drove on, he noticed that the forest had grown eerily silent. He couldn't hear the sound of rain hitting the leaves, or the chirping of crickets. Suddenly, he saw the glowing eyes again, this time right in front of him. He slammed on the brakes, but the car spun out of control and he crashed into a tree. When he came to, he was lying on the side of the road, dazed and disoriented. He looked around, but the deer was nowhere to be seen. His friend eventually arrived and drove him home, but John couldn't shake off the strange encounter. To this day, he still wonders what really happened on that dark and stormy night in the forest, haunted by the memory of the mysterious deer that disappeared without a trace.
It was a typical dreary evening, and I was relieved to finally be home after a long day at work. As I walked up to my front door, I noticed something strange. There were muddy footprints leading up to my doorstep. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. At first, I thought it must have been a neighbor or a delivery person, but the footprints were far too large. I started to feel uneasy, but I convinced myself that it was nothing and went inside. The next few days were filled with heavy rain, and every time I came home, there were more footprints on my doorstep. I started to get paranoid. I called the police, but when they arrived at my house, they only took a cursory look around, snapped a few pictures, and promised to increase patrols in the neighborhood. I decided to take action. I bought a video camera and installed it outside my front door. That night, as the rain poured down, I went to bed feeling a little more secure. The next morning, I woke up and checked the video footage, and my heart sank. The camera had caught the exact moment when the footprints appeared, but there was no one there. The muddy prints just appeared by themselves, as if by magic. I watched in horror as the footprints slowly formed on my doorstep. I had no explanation for what was happening. I tried to rationalize it, but my mind kept coming back to the same conclusion: there was something supernatural at play. I tried to ignore it and go on with my life, but every time it rained, I would dread coming home to find those mysterious footprints on my doorstep once again. Years have passed since then, and I have since moved out of that house. But the memory of those unexplainable footprints still haunts me to this day. And even now, when it rains, I can't help but feel a sense of unease, wondering if those muddy footprints will once again appear on my doorstep.
Every day, Mark drove home from work on the same route. And every day, he saw the same homeless man standing on the corner of the street, begging for money. But there was something strange about the way the man stood that always gave Mark an uneasy feeling. The man was tall and thin, with sunken eyes and dirty clothes that hung off his frail frame. But it wasn't his appearance that made Mark uncomfortable. It was the way he stood perfectly still, with his arms at his sides, staring blankly ahead as if in a trance. At first, Mark tried to ignore the man, but the more he saw him, the more he became obsessed with figuring out what was going on. Every day, as he drove by, he studied the man's face, looking for any signs of life or movement. But there was nothing. One day, Mark decided to stop and talk to the man. As he got out of his car and walked over to the corner, he noticed that the man's eyes followed him, but his body remained completely still. "Hey, man," Mark said, holding out a few dollars. "You okay?" The man said nothing. He didn't even seem to register Mark's presence. Mark tried again. "Can I help you with anything?" Still, no response. Mark started to feel uneasy. He was about to walk away when the man suddenly spoke, his voice low and raspy. "Leave me alone," the man said, his eyes locked on Mark's. Mark backed away, feeling a cold shiver run down his spine. He got in his car and drove away, vowing never to stop there again. But the image of the man's lifeless stare haunted him for weeks afterward. He couldn't shake off the feeling that there was something unnatural about the way the man stood, as if he was being controlled by some unseen force. To this day, Mark avoids that corner, and he warns others to stay away. Because he knows that if they look into the man's lifeless eyes, they may never be the same again.
I was walking home from work, enjoying the peacefulness of the quiet neighborhood. As I turned the corner, I noticed a man in the distance who seemed to be staring at me. I tried to ignore him and continued on my way, but as I picked up my pace, the man began to follow me. I tried to shake him off, but he kept getting closer and closer. The more I walked, the more my heart raced, and I began to feel uneasy. I didn't recognize the man and didn't know what he wanted. The street I was on was lined with tall trees that cast long, eerie shadows across the pavement. The only sound was the crunch of my footsteps on the gravel. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, and each time I did, the man seemed to be getting closer. Finally, I arrived at my house, a small, cozy bungalow that sat at the end of the street. I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock the door as quickly as possible. As I turned around, I saw the man standing just a few feet away, staring at me with his cold, lifeless eyes. I ran inside, locked the door, and called the police. They arrived quickly, but the man had already disappeared into the darkness. For weeks afterward, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. Every time I walked down the street, I felt like someone was following me. The memory of the man's cold, lifeless stare haunted me for years to come. But I refused to let him control me. I installed extra locks on my doors and windows, and I made sure to never walk alone at night again. I was determined to take control of my safety, no matter what.
In the middle of the city, there was an abandoned building that always emitted a loud noise. The residents of the neighboring buildings had grown accustomed to it, and assumed that it was just homeless people taking shelter in the deserted building. Despite several attempts, nobody was ever able to enter the building or investigate the noise. But one night, a group of curious residents decided to investigate the building once and for all. They broke into the building and searched for the source of the noise. As they moved further into the building, the noise grew louder and more intense. Suddenly, they heard a strange whispering coming from the shadows. The residents froze in fear, and the whispering grew louder and more insistent. They decided to split up to cover more ground, but as they ventured deeper into the building, they realized that they were not alone. They felt a chilling presence behind them, following their every move. They heard footsteps and felt a cold breeze brush past them. They knew that they were being watched, but by what, they did not know. As they reached the top floor, the noise grew louder and more intense. Suddenly, they heard a loud, piercing scream. They rushed to the source of the sound and found a door that was locked from the inside. They forced it open and found themselves in a room that was empty except for a single, old radio that was still playing. The residents could not believe it. They had been scared for nothing, and the noise was just an old radio that had been left on for years. They laughed and left the building, relieved that their fears had been unfounded. However, as they walked away from the building, they could still hear the noise echoing in their ears. It was as if the noise had imprinted itself onto their very souls. They knew that they could never forget the sound of that noise, and it would haunt them for the rest of their lives.